Have you ever been treated by your own parents like you were a bad omen? I wasn't abandoned because I did something wrong. I was abandoned because I existed. When I was 6 years old, my parents took me away from our small Texas town. They said I was going to live with an aunt. They hugged me, set my little suitcase down in front of a cold, iron gate, and turned around and walked away. I stood there, surrounded by strangers, and waited. Waited for someone to come back. But no one did. To them, I was the kid who brought bad luck. From the day I was born, my grandfather died. Their store burned down. My twin brother my other half died in a freak accident. They never said it was my fault. But every look, every whispered prayer at the dinner table said it for them. 20 years later, I stood in a federal courtroom. Across from someone pale-faced, eyes darting away. The same person who once called me a curse. I was the judge. They were the defendant. And this isn't a story about revenge. It's the story of a child erased from her own family, who stood up and made them say her name again loud and clear. My name is Elena Marquez. And I came back. Not to apologize, but to deliver judgment. I was born on a stormy night in Lubbock, Texas. My mom said that the moment she went into labor, lightning struck the wooden cross behind the church. A week later, our family's store burned down. 2 months after that, my grandfather died of a stroke. And by my first birthday, my twin brother Elias drowned in a pond just a few hundred yards from our house. No one ever said it out loud, but I grew up in a house where every brick seemed to whisper, "It's your fault." Alut. I never understood why my mother looked at me with that haunted expression every morning. I didn't know why my father would place his hand on my forehead at night like he was checking for something dark growing inside me. I was the only child who wasn't allowed at the Sunday dinner table. Grandma said, "Feed her later, because she needs time to reflect." I just nodded and quietly ate cold leftovers after everyone had laughed and finished. I thought maybe all families were like that. But by the time I turned 6, that difference became impossible to ignore. One June morning, my mom woke me up early. She said we were going to visit Aunt Clara, a woman I'd never met. She brushed my hair, dressed me in my Easter Sunday dress, and told me not to ask too many questions. "You need to know when to stay quiet," she said, fastening my buttons while looking at me through the mirror. I nodded. My father's pickup drove past the edge of town, through neighborhoods I didn't recognize, until we stopped in front of a dull gray building with iron gates and a sign that read, "Little Pines Care Center." Before I could ask anything, my mother stepped out, yanked my suitcase from the truck bed. My dad stayed seated, gripping the wheel tight, eyes locked forward. I asked in a small voice, "Aren't we going to Aunt Clara's?" My mom didn't answer. She handed me off to a woman in a light blue uniform and coldly signed a form. The woman knelt down, took my hand. "Hello, Lena, this is your home now." I turned to look at my mother. She wasn't crying. She just stood tall, nodded once at the woman. No hug, no smile. Just the back of her white blouse disappearing behind the closing gate. I stood there holding a red suitcase, wearing shoes that pinched my toes and asked a question I'd whisper for years. Why? The first days at Little Pines felt like being dunked in cold water. Everything was unfamiliar, including my name. They gave me a new tag, Lena Cruz. I asked why we couldn't use my real name, Elena Marquez. One staffer just smiled. "Sometimes, starting over is better, sweetie." But I wasn't starting over. I was being erased. That name, that face, those rare hugs from my twin. All locked away in a place I couldn't reach. The staff called me the quiet one. I didn't talk much. I was afraid that if I said the wrong thing, I'd be sent somewhere even worse. Each morning, I lined up for food, sat in my assigned seat, finished every worksheet. I learned to survive by watching. I knew which kids snapped fast, which ones stole, which ones only pretended to be kind. Every week, some kids left adopted or moved to another facility. But not me. Once, I overheard a caseworker whisper. Her old family said she brings bad luck. Nobody wants to take that risk. I didn't know what bad luck meant back then. But I knew what it felt like to be treated as dangerous, just for surviving. I started keeping a journal, not with pen and paper, but in my memory. I remembered every name that turned me away. Every word that haunted me. Every file with my name spelled wrong. And I repeated my real name over and over in my head. Elena Marquez. I didn't want to forget. Even if the world pretended I didn't exist, I wouldn't. One night, I dreamed of Elias, my twin. In the dream, he held my hand. He didn't speak. He just led me out of a dark room and pointed toward the sky. I woke up with tears soaking my pillow. That was the first time I didn't feel completely alone. 3 years after I was left behind, a group of volunteers came to the center for weekend reading programs. Among them was an old man, thin, silver-haired, always carrying a worn leather bag. His name was Raymond Hawkins. Unlike the others who read comic books or coloring stories, he read legal books not for kids, but for himself. And I would sit close by, pretending to read, just to listen. One day, he caught my gaze. He smiled and handed me a thin book titled Legal Rights of Minors in the State of Texas. "You like law?" he asked. I nodded slightly. "Then, read it. Knowing the law means knowing how to protect yourself." From that day on, I showed up early whenever he came. And for the first time in my life, someone looked at Menno like I was cursed, but like I was someone worth listening to. I didn't know where life would take me. But I knew one thing. If someone out there was rewriting my story, I'd learn how to take the pen. And this time, I'd be the one doing the writing. The name Lena Cruz was printed on my school ID, my medical records, even on the first certificate I ever got for scoring high in history. No one ever asked if I wanted to use that name. They just said, "This is your legal name now. Your former parents signed over your identity when they gave up guardianship." A social worker said it like she was talking about changing bedsheets flat, emotionless. But I remembered Elena Marquez. I remembered how my mom once said that name when calling me to dinner for the first time back when I was still small, before everything fell apart. I remembered how Elias scribbled my name inside his coloring book and laughed when he mashed it with his own. Elena and Elias, the unbeatable team. I used to believe that. At Little Pines, I learned to look at files the way grown-ups looked at shoes. Something that can be replaced but always leaves a mark. One day, while organizing documents for a new staffer, I came across a strange form with my name on it. Not Lena Cruz. Elena Marquez, not suitable for family placement. Displays heightened emotional reactivity. Unsafe in environments requiring connection. At the bottom was the signature of a psychologist. I had never met him. I held my breath and slipped the paper into my pocket. I didn't eat lunch that day. I hid behind the library and opened it again. Every line punched me in the chest. They had built a file that turned me into a warning Signone red flag in a sea of white records. I stored it under the stiff folder at the bottom of my personal drawer. Then came more pages. A copy of the guardianship transfer with my mother's signature. A foster rejection letter where a couple wrote, "The child is not compatible with our spiritual environment." Oh wait. A medical record stating, "Child displays deceptive speech and abnormal response to negative emotion." I was only 12. I'd never hit anyone. Never acted out. All I did was remember. And somehow, remembering too well was the thing that scared them most. Mr. Hawkins kept coming to the library every Saturday. He didn't ask questions. He didn't coddle. We just read. I learned phrases like legal identity affirmation, judicial record access, and reassertion of citizenship identity. To him, those were legal tools. To me, they were strands of rope, something I could twist into a lifeline to climb out of the pit grown-ups had thrown me into. One day, I asked him, "Can I get my old name back?" He nodded. "If you're old enough, have the right paperwork, and know what you're doing." I stared at the table. "Then I'll do it," I said. From that day on, I started writing my real name every night. On pillowcases. On book spines. On the back of lunch receipts. I had to keep it alive. I had to prove I hadn't vanished. The world around me kept operating with names they thought made everything easier to manage. But I started to see more clearly. A name isn't just what people call you. It's what keeps you from slipping through the cracks of paperwork and prejudice. It's what lets you stand up and say, "I am me, and I never agreed to be replaced." At 13, I began drafting my first summary of how to restore a legal name. I wasn't sure if the law allowed it, but I started digging. Every time someone wasn't looking, I copied legal clauses from the library's books, folded them tight, and hid them in a tin box under my bed. I called it my resurrection file. It was how I'd return to myself line by line. A month later, an intern journalist came to the center to write about the youth care system. They asked if anyone wanted to share their experience. For the first time in my life, I raised my hand in a crowd. "I have something to say," I told them. "What's your name?" the reporter asked. I took a deep breath. Everyone around me thought I was Lena. But I was done pretending. Elena, I said. Elena Marquez. The reporter smiled and wrote it down. And I trembled not from fear, but because, for the first time in 6 years, someone else heard my name and didn't erase it. I didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in my life, hope didn't feel like a fantasy. It was beginning with a name I'd held onto in silence, even when the world tried to throw it away. And I would never let anyone take it from me again. After I said my real name out loud in that interview with the reporter, no one at the center said a word. No scolding. No reprimand. No come to the office, like I'd imagined. But the silence was worse. Everything felt slower. Every glance that passed over me lingered just a moment too long. A week later, they called me down to the administrative office for a routine file review. I sat up straight in a cold plastic chair across from a young social worker with hastily tied hair and strong perfume. She flipped through a folder, page after page. "Do you know what your current legal name is?" she asked, eyes still on the papers. "Yes," I said. "And you understand that using another name can cause confusion in your records, right?" That name wasn't my choice. And I never agreed to it. For the first time, she looked up at me. Not angry, just slightly thrown off. Maybe she'd never heard a child say that before. I had thought it hundreds of times. After that meeting, I wasn't punished. But I started to notice little changes. The staff became more cautious when they talked to me. A few began calling me Marquez, though their voices carried hesitation. The other kids, more curious than scared, started whispering. One asked, "Are you the one whose parents ditched her?" I didn't answer. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wasn't sure anymore why I'd been left, only that I was, and no one had the courage to explain why. That night, I pulled the tin box from under my bed. I unfolded every document I had, laid them out, and counted. 13. 13 pieces of paper. Guardianship termination, a shallow psychological report, a file about the 2001 incident when Elias was left outside in the cold, and the official name change form. Each one was a scar from being turned from a real person into a blank file. I began copying them by hand into a new notebook, neatly and carefully. I called it my evidence journal. I didn't know when the day would come, but I believed it would, and when it did, I would be ready to show the truth. Not for revenge, but to prove that I had existed. That I had been erased intentionally. One Saturday afternoon, Mr. Hawkins didn't show up at the library. I waited until the staff turned off the lights to close up. Worried. A little empty. But exactly 1 week later, he returned with a light bandage on his right hand. "Fell down the stairs," he said casually, like it wasn't worth talking about. But he brought a gift. An old, leather-bound book titled, "Restoring Identity, Legal Paths for Foster Youth." Inside the cover, he'd written, "For Elena, no one can take away what you protect with your memory." I finished the book in 3 nights. And for the first time, I realized that restoring your legal identity wasn't some distant dream. It was a process, complicated, yes, but real. There were rules, steps, and I could follow them. I made a list. A name affirmation affidavit. My original birth certificate. Proof my name had been changed without consent. I wasn't old enough to file yet, but I could be ready. And I would be ready. A month later, I was moved into the career prep group. The last stop before kids without families turned 18 and had to make it on their own. Not everyone was excited to be there. Most saw it as a waiting room for failure. But I didn't. I saw it as a door. My assigned room was a small dorm with a desk and a window overlooking the parking lot. Not cozy. Not pretty. But it was the first space that was mine. I taped a note to the wall in red ink. Elena Marquez, first witness of her own life. They gave me my own library card and a bus pass with limited hours. Every Thursday afternoon, I took the bus to the city library. And there, in the legal archives section, I started studying like my life depended on every line of print. I knew I couldn't change the past. I couldn't make my parents admit what they did. But I could take back the very first thing they ever stole. My name, my voice, and the right not to be treated like a curse. I am not bad luck. I'm just the one who remembers. When everyone else chose to forget. At the Career Prep Center, I became known not for the usual reasons. Not because I dressed weird or could win a fight. But because I was always writing. During lunch breaks, When other teens slipped out back to smoke or gossip, I sat with my brown notebook, black ink pen, and pages filled with words that didn't belong in the world of kids who'd been left behind. Legal. Identity restoration. Formal declaration. Filing fees. I wasn't a model student. I failed math 3 times. Got written up for refusing to perform a group skit in English class. But there was one thing I never skipped: the library. Every Thursday afternoon, I took the number 17 bus to the Lubbock Public Library. Frosted glass doors, dim yellow lights, scratched-up wooden tables. But in that place, I had something no group home or supervision unit could give me: the right to choose what I learned. I could read anything. And more than anything, I could be left alone. One afternoon, I was copying notes from an old law book when an older man approached. Gray shirt, holding 3 books on criminal law. He paused when he saw my title. "You're reading state custody and emancipation law?" he asked, voice low and measured. I looked up. Yes. Not the usual middle school read. "I'm not in middle school anymore," I said. "I'm prepping for the GED." He sat across from me. "I'm a legal advisor at West Texas University's law program. If you're self-studying, maybe I can help." I stared at him for a few seconds. After years in a system where every adult's words came loaded with hidden motives, I'd learned to spot the difference between real kindness and fake curiosity. But he didn't ask where I came from. Didn't ask why I was studying that stuff. He just said, "You're researching to get somewhere. I can help with directions." His name was Mr. Bain. After that first meeting, we agreed to meet once a week at the library. No pressure. No lectures. He explained the concepts I didn't understand, lent me old textbooks, and sometimes just sat and read beside me. Like Mr. Hawkins once did. Only this time, I was the one asking questions. One afternoon, I brought him part of my file, the one I'd copied and carefully wrapped in plastic sleeves, each labeled with a date, source, and name. He flipped through them, eyebrows tightening. "You did all of this yourself?" I figured I'd need it. No one believes you without proof. He laid a hand on the folder, gentle but firm. "You're right. This system will always value paper over quiet truth." I used to fear documents. They were evidence of rejection. But now, I was turning them into weapons of my own. At 16 and a half, I completed my GED. No ceremony. No gown. No applause. Just a certificate, printed in blue ink, quietly slid through a mail slot. I held it like someone holding a map home. I applied for a college support program for youth without legal guardians. The form asked for legal identity. I froze at the line. Full legal name on record. I stared at the form. Then I flipped to the back and added a note. Legal name, Lena Cruz. True and used name, Elena Marquez. Petition for identity restoration pending. 3 weeks later, I got an email. "We're prepared to review your financial aid upon verified identity restoration." I understood. The door was about to open. But only if I made the system say my real name out loud and on record. I met Mr. Bain at the library, carrying every file I had. He helped me draft my first petition. Petition to restore legal birth identity. 18 sections. Nearly 30 pages. Plus an appendix, over 50 pages of documents I had gathered over 7 years. Before submitting, I signed the bottom of the form. Not as Lena. Not with an initial. I wrote in bold, black ink. Elena Marquez. No backing down. No hiding. I had held that name for years in silence. Now, it was time to force the world to recognize. I never disappeared. I had only been hidden. And now I had proof. I mailed the petition the next morning. When the envelope slid out of sight through the mail slot, I didn't feel relieved. I felt ready. Ready to confront. Ready to step out of the story someone else wrote for me. I was no longer just the kid labeled as a liability. I was the one rewriting my own file. And this time, no one's changing my name again. After I mailed the petition to restore my identity, I lived each day in a breathless kind of waiting. Every morning, I opened the mailbox at the career center like I was disarming a landmine, shaky, tense, but unable not to look. Week 1 passed with nothing. Week 2, still silence. Then, in the 3rd week, I received a large envelope stamped from the office of the Lubbock County Judge. I didn't open it right away. I carried it to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at the sender line. My hands were sweaty. Inside was a notice. The court had accepted my petition to restore my legal identity. I was scheduled for a preliminary hearing on the 17th of April. It was a Wednesday. 3 weeks away. I looked at the words, Elena Marquez, petitioner bold at the top of the page. And my heart thudded. For the first time in an official document, my name wasn't printed to signal an error. Not to warn. Not today. But to affirm. For the first time, I wasn't a ward or a subject under supervision. I was the one taking action. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing like it was a trial for my entire childhood. I reordered every copy in my file. The original birth certificate with my real name. The name change paperwork done without my consent. Letters stamped, returned to sender. The flawed psychological diagnoses. A GED certificate issued to Lena Cruz. And a college application under Elena Marquez. The day before the hearing, I visited the library. Mr. Bain was already there, waiting with a stack of printed excerpts from state law. Legal citations about reclaiming a name after an involuntary identity change. I've memorized most of it, I told him. Then speak it like it's your story, he said. The next morning, I walked into the courthouse with my file in hand and a mindset I'd never had in 17 years. I wasn't there to ask for permission to be myself. I was there to claim it. The Lubbock County Courthouse sat on a road I'd traveled down as a child. It was the place where my parents once signed away my name. Signed me out of their household records. I climbed the cold stone steps, carrying every folded memory in a thick stack of documents. The judge was a middle-aged man with glasses, a warm voice. His name was Mr. Rollins. When he called my case, he didn't ask, Lena or Elena. He simply read, Elena Marquez petitioner. Without hesitation. I almost cried at just that. I stood before the bench, presenting every piece of evidence. Every statute. Every fact that showed my name had been changed without consent. That I'd been mislabeled, erased like a clerical error. Judge Rollins listened silently. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush me. When I reached the line from my old file that said, child is a bad omen not suitable for stable environments, my hands trembled. But my voice stayed firm. I'm not asking to be accepted, I said, steady. I'm just asking to be called by my name. He nodded. After reviewing my file, he looked up, placed his hand on the court record, and said, the court grants the petitioner's request. Legal name restored. Elena Marquez. He struck the gavel. 3 knocks. No applause. No stage lights. But if there'd ever been a storm inside me, that was the moment it finally calmed. Outside the courtroom, I walked the hallway my parents had once walked down. This time holding a copy of the judge's order. A woman I didn't know, maybe a clerk, passed by, glanced at the paper, and smiled. Congratulations, Miss Marquez. Miss Marquez. I didn't say anything. I just nodded. But inside, every cut from the past felt like it was being stitched closed. One letter at a time. Elena. And now, that name is back. Not just in my head, but on paper. On school rosters. On my GED certificate. On my college acceptance email. On the bank account I opened myself. On the cover letter I'm sending to the law school I plan to apply to. This time, the system is going to learn how to spell my name. And this time, I won't let them forget it. I received my acceptance letter to the West Texas University School of Law on a scorching June afternoon. The envelope was embossed with the torch of justice, bold black ink on crisp white paper, and a single line at the top. Congratulations, Elena Marquez. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stared at it for a long time. And then, almost instinctively, I turned to the small file cabinet in my room. I pulled out the stack I had once called my denial file. Page by page, guardianship rejections, falsified medical records, miswritten evaluations. I laid them out like pieces from a book that had finally reached its conclusion. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to touch them. I placed the entire file inside my old tin box, the one I used to hide under my bed when I was 12, reading it by flashlight in the dark. On the lid, I added a new label. Read. Understood. Survived. Oh. The law school dorm wasn't fancy. My room was small, the walls painted gray, the window looking out over a parking lot. But in that space, no one called me a management risk. No one quietly changed my name on class lists. No one eyed me with suspicion because I had no legal guardian. I walked into class like everyone else. Except I carried a lifetime of evidence, and a heart that had learned how to stand firm against verdicts handed down in silence. My first class was constitutional law and civil rights. The professor was a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair, the kind of voice that could slice through noise like a pencil-sharpening blade. When she asked, "Who can give an example of the government wrongfully stripping someone's identity?" my hand went up, without hesitation. I didn't talk about myself. I spoke of a girl imaginary named in foster care, mislabeled, and erased from the system without being asked. My tone was calm, precise, backed by case law. The room went quiet. The professor nodded. Solid. No dramatics, clear. After class, a student came up to me. "You're Elena, right? That breakdown you gave was sharp and deep." I nodded. "Yeah, I'm Elena." I no longer had to assert, Marquez. No more attaching handwritten notes to applications explaining why my name didn't match. I had come back to myself. Not with a parent's signature. Not with family's approval. But with the law. The truth. And my own will. Still, I carried the old silence. It didn't vanish. It lingered in dreams. In the way I flinched when someone on television said, "Lena." Or in how I avoided the eyes of women who looked like my mother. Same dress style, same cold tone when making life-changing decisions like they were just stamping a form. I don't forgive. But I don't live for revenge either. I live to become the version of myself they never saw coming. The one they tried to erase. I am Elena Marquez, law student, once renamed, once boxed in, once quietly pushed out of my own story. Now, I'm learning to steer that story. Not to rewrite the past, but to move forward. Toward a future where the law isn't a tool for erasure, but a force for restoration. And I swear in everything I've been through, there will come a day when they'll be forced to hear my name again. In a courtroom where I'll be the one holding the gavel. In my second year of college, I was selected as a research assistant for a professor who taught family law and child welfare. When I got the email, my hands trembled. Not from nerves, but because I knew exactly what this meant. My first real chance to walk directly into the system that once erased me. Not as a victim, but as someone who knew its inner workings from the inside out. My job was to help analyze case files involving violations of children's rights, and recommend policy reforms based on real cases. Hundreds of pages of documentation came in weekly from counties all over Texas. Files filled with the names of kids I'd never met, but somehow saw myself in over and over again. One October afternoon, I opened file TX 2735. A 13-year-old girl named Amara J. Transferred to 4 foster facilities in 6 months. Reason listed: mild behavioral disorder, incompatible with environments housing younger children. I stared at the diagnosis, worded almost exactly like the one that once showed up in my file. The same cold phrasing, the same lack of responsibility. I placed my hand on the folder. My chest tightened. Not from shock, but from a terrifying sense of recognition. That night, I couldn't sleep. I pulled out my old denial file for the first time in months, laying it open under the glow of my desk lamp. I read every page, every typewritten line, every red ink note, every signature of people who decided my future in the span of 3 minutes and a paper flip. I didn't cry. I took notes. I rewrote. I opened my laptop and drafted a formal petition analyzing how foster institutions weaponize presumptive medical language to justify pushing kids out of the system, and proposed a policy requiring independent cross-evaluation of every psychological diagnosis in foster care. I sent the proposal to my professor, no backstory attached. Just a name. Elena Marquez, research assistant. 3 days later, she called me into her office. "You've lived in the system, haven't you?" she asked. No small talk. I met her eyes. Yes. That paper. It didn't read like something from a student who's only read books. It read like someone who's lived it. I nodded. She didn't pry. She simply slid a white envelope across the desk. "This is a recommendation letter for the Texas State Child Advocacy Internship. I think you're ready." I took it. At the bottom, her signature in bold. Dr. Marcia Klein, Chair of Family Law. That night, I submitted my application. In the personal statement, I didn't call myself a victim. I wrote, "I was once labeled, but I refuse to be reduced to a number in someone else's file. I want to be the last set of eyes on those papers. to make sure no child is ever erased by a few careless lines of copy. I was accepted. 3 months later, I walked into the Texas Child Advocacy Office, the legal arm that represents children without adult voices beside them. 4th floor. Not a big office, but every desk was a front line. I was assigned to assist an attorney named Madison, a sharp black woman with laser eyes and a voice that never rose above what was necessary. "Read this and prep for me," she said, handing me a file. A 15-year-old marked difficult to place after reporting abuse by her stepfather. 3 facility transfers. No one believes her. I didn't ask questions. I read. And when I walked into my first hearing as a legal assistant, I didn't sit behind the bench like a student observer. I sat beside the attorney, eyes locked on the judge, an older man with salt and pepper hair and gold-rimmed glasses. I used to be afraid of men like him. But now I knew. If I held my ground, the truth wouldn't stay buried. As the hearing began, Madison glanced at me. "You have the rebuttal data ready?" "Every line," I replied. I was once the kid buried in a file. Now, I was the one crossing out the lies. I don't need their apologies. I don't need anyone to admit they were wrong. All I need is this: that when a child speaks, someone listens. And this time, that someone is me. I don't know who nominated me. All I know is that one Tuesday morning, my inbox held an email from the organizing committee of the statewide child law conference held in Austin. They invited me to be the opening speaker representing young law students with lived experience in the child welfare system to open this year's theme: identity, justice, and the right to exist. I read the subject line 3 times. The invitation was formal, with an attached PDF, official state seal, and all the trappings. But what made me stop was the bold line at the bottom. Name to appear on conference badge: Elena Marquez, legal assistant, West Texas Law. No asterisk. No, formerly known as. No alternate name. Just me. A few years ago, I'd attended conferences like this sitting in the back row, filling notebooks with quotes no one would ever read. Once, I raised my hand to ask a speaker how a child could restore a name deleted from the system. They hesitated, then pivoted to another question. They had no answer. This time, I was the one standing at the podium. I didn't tell anyone at school. I didn't post about it online. I didn't invite friends. I printed a single copy of my speech, folded it into thirds, and tucked it into the inside pocket of my blazer. The conference hall that day was lit bright with overhead lights, rows of chairs perfectly aligned. Dozens of attorneys, shelter directors, therapists, a few federal officials filled the room. A volunteer pinned the name badge to my chest. They didn't know why my hand trembled when I saw Elena Marquez printed in clean, black ink on white. I stepped on stage to polite applause. They didn't know who I was, only that I was a young person invited to speak. I stood behind the podium, took a breath, not looking at my paper, not looking at the audience, just staring straight ahead, and began. Some children are labeled problems before they're old enough to spell their own names. No one moved. I went on. I was one of those children. Renamed. Misrepresented in medical files, rejected because of labels no one ever bothered to verify. I told the story briefly. Not with pity, but with precision. From being institutionalized for being different, to teaching myself the law, to restoring my name using the same file they once used to erase me. I'm not telling this story to ask for sympathy, I said. I'm telling it because some children don't need rescuing. They need to be believed. The room was silent. Because when identity is erased with a stamp, it's not the child who disappears. It's the responsibility of adults that gets wiped away. I paused and closed with one final sentence. And today, when I'm called by my real name Elena Marquez, it's not a miracle. It's the result of a fight I never should have had to fight alone. Applause rose. Soft at first, then spreading. A woman in the front row stood. Then another. I bowed my head. Not to appear moved, but to keep the tears from falling. As I stepped off stage, a middle-aged man came up to shake my hand. Worn face, pressed shirt, conference badge that read, Director, Lubbock Community Shelter. S spoke quietly. You're the Elena Marquez? I nodded. He paused, then said, I saw your file, years ago. Thank you for making us read what we signed. I didn't reply. I just met his eyes and said, thank you for remembering. That night, I sat alone in a modest hotel room in Austin. Soft yellow light. A breeze through the open window. I checked my inbox. There was an email from a reporter at a legal journal. Subject line: Elena Marquez's shattering speech. A story pulled from the dust of old files. I didn't open it right away. I just sat there, my hand resting over my chest, where the name badge had just been removed. No more hiding behind a tin box under the bed. No more secrets. I had stepped into the light. Not because someone opened the door for me, but because I had learned to open it myself. And from now on, I won't step back. I am Elena Marquez. And now, people are finally listening. News of my speech spread faster than I expected. Within a week, I received nearly 20 emails. Some offered congratulations. Some shared their stories. And some were only a few words long like, I was one of the kids no one believed, too. But one email stopped me cold. From g.holloway@healtharchivestx.org. Subject: Intake Form, 2001. Message: I was the one who admitted you on your first day at Little Pines. I still have the original intake file. If you ever need me to testify, just say the word. I reread the name, Gwen Holloway. It wasn't unfamiliar. She was the only person who, when I was 6, had ever called me sweetheart. The woman who placed a packet of marshmallows on my lunch tray after I cried all night. I don't remember her face clearly, but I remember her voice. Soft, like a blanket being pulled over your shoulders on a cold night. I replied that very night. I will need that file. And if you're willing, I'd like you to testify. 3 days later, I received a scanned copy of the original intake form. It read: Name, Elena Marquez. Psychological status: stable. No signs of behavioral or verbal harm. Additional notes: admitted at parent request. No medical documentation attached. That document became the cornerstone of a new wall. Not one to shut me in, but one built to stand up for the truth. I immediately forwarded a copy to the Texas State Office of Legal and Medical Ethics, which was investigating false psychological labeling within the foster system. I attached the intake form, my name change paperwork, the questionable diagnosis reports, and my own handwritten statement. At the end of the letter, I wrote, I'm not seeking redemption, I'm seeking light. And light must be turned on where darkness was once used to rewrite someone's name. Oh, a month later, I received formal notice. I was invited to testify before the State Ethics Board. This time, I wasn't alone. Sitting beside me was Miss Gwen Holloway, now silver-haired, holding the original file she'd kept safe for over 2 decades. She sat at my side during the hearing. When asked why she kept the intake form, she said, because I knew something didn't feel right. And I promised myself that if that little girl ever came back, I'd give her what the system tried to take, proof that she wasn't unstable. She was simply forgotten. I recounted every step of being renamed, mislabeled, erased piece by piece. Each point linked to a document, a date, a signature. When I read aloud the evaluation note that said, Elena poses a risk to child-centered environments. I held up a photo taken when I was 10. Me, coloring at a table with other kids, a quiet smile on my face. This is the counter-evidence, I said. Not to prove I was sweet, but to show that the truth can't be captured by a lazy sentence written by a doctor who once played golf with my father. The room fell silent. One attorney on the panel leaned back, set down his pen, and said, We've reviewed a lot of cases, but this is the first time someone's brought the original intake form, a live witness, and knew exactly what they were doing. I didn't feel like I'd won. I just felt right. 3 weeks later, the board released its formal findings. Dr. Leland Beck, the psychiatrist who signed the false psychological report, was permanently stripped of his license. Little Pines facility was ordered to audit every child's file from 2000 to 2010. Lubbock County Child Welfare Office issued an official apology broadcast internally across all state care agencies. I printed the findings, not to hang on a wall, but to close the chapter. Not because I'd forgotten, but because I'd reclaimed what was mine. The next morning, I stood before the mirror, dressed in professional clothes, ready for work at the legal office. I pinned on my name badge. Bold print. Elena Marquez, Legal Assistant, Texas Office for Child Advocacy. I looked at myself in the mirror. No longer the girl standing in front of an iron gate, clutching a red suitcase. waiting for someone to come back. No longer someone who had to repeat her name to people who didn't want to remember it. I don't need them to remember anymore. Because I've made my name impossible to forget. I didn't graduate law school with perfect grades, but my transcript was unnervingly strong in the subjects most students avoided: child law, civil rights, and administrative conflict. I didn't just study those classes. I lived them. Every statute I memorized wasn't to pass an exam. It was to protect a version of myself still out there somewhere. In transitional housing. In group homes. In files buried under phrases like safe transfer or suitable placement. End of chapter. After passing the bar, I was accepted into the county's Young Judge Fellowship program. Not because they gave me a chance, but because my application was airtight. Undeniable. Within 2 years, I became the youngest judge in Lubbock County history, assigned to coordinate cases involving children's rights. I walked into courtrooms holding the very gavel that once terrified me. When it struck down to declare a child would be relocated, renamed, stripped from everything familiar. Now, that gavel was in my hand. One Monday, I received a new case assignment. A complaint about abuse of authority by a family-based charity known for giving scholarships to adoptive families. The name of the organization: the Gracewell Foundation. Current director: Isabel Beck. I read the name 3 times. My heartbeat slowed. Not out of shock, but because I always knew this day would come. Isabel Beck. My mother. I didn't recuse myself. I didn't declare a conflict of interest. I reviewed the case fully, precisely, and with a kind of cold clarity. The foundation was accused of accepting funding to support adoptions, but rejecting children deemed emotionally unfit, based on internal assessments. Assessments written by none other than Dr. Leland Beck. Everything was repeating itself. I walked into the hearing, took the bench, put on my robe, and presided as judge. In front of me, legal reps in neat rows. Media seated in the back. And in the 3rd row, Isabel Beck. Hair still dyed deep brown. Gray dress, perfectly tailored. Her expression calm, like she still believed everything was under control. She didn't recognize me. I opened proceedings by reading the personnel list aloud. When I reached Dr. Leland Beck, evaluator, a ripple of whispers passed through the room. I tapped the gavel lightly. Order. I ran the hearing by the book. No tremble. No deviation. But when we reached the evidence presentation, the plaintiff's attorney submitted a file with an attached Appendix B, a copy of the 2001 intake form, clearly stating that Elena Marquez had her name changed, without any medical or judicial reason. It was stamped. I scanned the document, set it down, and when I looked up, our eyes met. For the first time, I saw confusion. Isabel Beck slowly stood. Permission to speak, Your Honor? Her attorney tried to stop her, but I nodded. Permission granted. She looked directly at me. I didn't know the judge today was. I cut in, calmly. We're here to address structural misconduct within your organization, not personal relationships. Please proceed with your statement. Her face stiffened. We used to believe some children just didn't fit. You can't force a wrong-shaped piece into a family like a Lego block. I stayed silent. She went on, voice quieter now. But maybe it wasn't the kids who didn't fit. Maybe it was us too afraid to change our expectations. I nodded once, then said, "The court will proceed." 3 strikes of the gavel later, I ruled. Gracewell Foundation is to be suspended pending full investigation. All internal diagnoses must be independently reevaluated. After the hearing, I returned to chambers. My assistant handed me a cream envelope. No return address. Inside was an old photo. Me, at age 6, standing outside Little Pines, clutching a red suitcase. On the back, one handwritten line. I didn't believe you back then. Now I do. But I no longer have the right to say so. I folded the photo. No trembling. No pain. I filed it under a folder labeled, "Closed." Dated, Monday, 3rd week of March. The day the girl once called a bad omen. Rendered a final judgment. One no one could reverse. I opened a drawer, pulled out a blank sheet of paper. At the top, I wrote, "Draft. The Marquez Act Safeguarding Original Identity in the Child Welfare System." And I began to type. not to fix the past, but so that no other child would stand at the doors of a foster center, carrying a name that wasn't theirs, waiting for someone who'd never come back. Because now, that last door has been opened by me, and I will never let it close again. I submitted the first draft of the Marquez bill on the morning of my 30th birthday. No cake. No party. Just me, a clean blazer, and a bound 52-page document titled, Protecting Original Identity in the Child Welfare System, the Marquez Bill. The bill wasn't poetic. It wasn't long-winded. Just 3 clear points. 1. Ban all legal name changes for children in the foster system unless there is verified medical, judicial, and clearly expressed consent from the child. R. Each child must be assigned an identity monitor, an independent official unaffiliated with the care facility tasked with overseeing any changes to personal records. 3. All documentation tied to a child's original identity must be preserved for at least 25 years and handed over to the child when they turn 18. No exceptions. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Foster organizations wouldn't like it. It stripped away their control. They'd argue the child needs to assimilate quickly. I do frost, but assimilation doesn't mean erasing a name. Scrubbing away origin? Rewriting history in red ink. For nearly a year, I traveled across counties presenting, hosting roundtables, persuading lawmakers, attorneys, advocates, and former system kids like me. Some listened and nodded. Some pushed back. But most stayed silent. I was used to that silence. Because I knew. Silence always comes right before people start truly listening. One late autumn day, I was invited to speak before the State Legislative Committee on Child Protection. They didn't call me a witness. They called me the bill's sponsor. I stood in a cold hearing room, reading aloud what I had written in a steady voice. I told the story of a girl whose name was changed without her knowledge. A child labeled with unfamiliar words. Someone who spent years fighting to reclaim what had always been hers. The right to be called by her true name. When I finished, a state senator asked, "Do you believe a 6-year-old knows what name they truly want?" I answered, "Not always. But I do know this. At 6, I didn't know I would become a lawyer. But I knew my name wasn't Lena. I knew that when people said it, I didn't want to respond. And I knew the feeling of vanishing when no one called me by the name my birth mother once whispered beside my crib." The room fell silent. A week later, the Marquez bill was unanimously approved by the Committee for Advancement to the State House. On the drive home, I got a call from an unknown number. "Miss Marquez?" A middle-aged man's voice. "Speaking. I used to work in the residency records office back in 2001. When your name was changed. It was marked as urgent by someone very close to the Becks." I said nothing. He's since passed. But I never deleted the second copy of your original birth certificate. If you need evidence, I'll send it. I thanked him. Not to keep fighting, but because deep down, I'd always known. Truth leaves a trace. And someone out there would keep it safe, waiting for the day it could come to light. The following month, I was invited to appear on a national broadcast about foster care reform. The host asked me, "If you could say one thing to that 6-year-old girl, what would it be?" I looked straight into the camera. I'd say, "You're not wrong. You don't deserve to be forgotten. And one day, you'll stand not to ask for an apology, but to redefine yourself." I left the studio in silence. But I knew somewhere out there, a child was sitting in a shelter, hugging a notebook, wondering who they were, and had just heard my name. And they now know. Someone who was once misnamed, rejected, buried in a file, made it out. I am Elena Marquez. And today, I am no longer the child left behind. I am the one writing the law, so no child will ever have their name erased again. One April morning, I stepped into a federal courtroom. For the first time in my career, I was appointed lead judge on a state-level trial. It wasn't just a large case in scale. It was heavy in meaning. The lawsuit was filed against a network of affiliated nonprofit organizations. Entities that once held authority over the placement, evaluation, and classification of minors in rural Texas foster shelters. They were accused of conspiring to create a re-identification system, a mechanism through which hundreds of children were renamed, stripped of their origins, and forced to live beneath identities the system deemed easier to manage. On the list of attending personnel that day, I saw 2 familiar names. Gerald Whitmore, former director of a foster care center, and Isabel Beck, listed on multiple internal memos. I took the bench in my black robe. My nameplate read, Honorable Elena Marquez. No one confused who I was anymore. In my hands were documents, evidence once buried, internal emails showing they knew it was wrong, but did it anyway. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaken. I just read, listened, and recorded. When it came time to deliver the ruling, I stood. The room was so quiet. You could hear the second hand on the wall clock tick. After reviewing all documents, testimonies, and evidence the court finds, I paused, looking directly at the defendants. That the organizations in question committed severe violations of personal identity rights, legal identity protections, and the autonomy of minors in state care. I went on, eyes unwavering. Renaming children, erasing origins, fabricating psychological labels without basis. These are not just ethical breaches. They are acts of human erasure. Amal. I laid my hand on the gavel. The court orders permanent suspension of all operations, full transfer of affected files to an independent oversight agency, and a publicly documented identity restoration process for all impacted youth. Bang. 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 3 strikes. Marking the end of a cycle of abuse that had lasted far too long. After the trial, I returned to my office and sat by the window, watching the city glow under the afternoon sun. My clerk entered, carrying a stack of documents. On top, a plain white envelope, no return address. I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was shaky, but deliberate. I'm not asking for forgiveness, because I know I don't deserve it. I only hope that, one day, if you read your name again, you'll know that somewhere, there is a mother. Late, but still trying to say it right for the very first time. No signature. But I knew who it was. I folded the letter gently. No bitterness. No sarcasm. I pulled out a blank sheet of paper and wrote a few quiet lines. I am Elena Marquez. I haven't forgotten. But I have moved forward. And I hope you do, too. I placed it in an envelope. Not to send, but to keep. A reminder that once, I was the child no one called by the right name. And now, I'm the one who made the system say it. Correctly. Fully. Loud like a bell. The next day, I walked out of court. The sky was still. Near the gate, a little girl with curly hair held the hand of a caseworker. She looked up at me and asked softly, Are you the lady who writes laws? I nodded. My name is Lila, she said. Not Lisa. Like they put on my papers. I smiled. Then say your name loud, Lila. I told her, kneeling beside her. Because from now on, the law is on your side. She nodded. I turned and kept walking. My name is Elena Marquez. I was abandoned. I was renamed. I was erased. But I came back. Not as a witness, but as the one holding the gavel. And this time, when I strike it down, it's so the world will finally hear the names of those who once had no one to speak for them.